Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this information session on planning reform this afternoon to give you an update on all the planning reforms which will be coming into force on the 1st of March. My name is Elise Saraceni. I am the Director of Reform Delivery here at Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. Today, I have with me Dan McGluggage from the Reform Delivery team as well. Before we get started, though, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. For me, that is the Whadjuk Noongar people. Appreciate that there may be people from other parts of the state, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. So in today's briefing, we'll have a bit of a look at the Planning and Development Amendment Act. It's a bit of a quick refresher on that. We'll then have a bit of a look at some of the detail from the significant development pathway, some of the detail of the DAP reforms, and look at other reform updates, the amendments to the residential design codes, a new online lodgement system, which will also be coming into force on the 1st of March, some of the changes to scheme amendment processes, state planning policies and planning codes. If I could ask you all to please hold your questions until the end of the presentation, that is probably the best way for us to do it. And if you could type any questions that you might have into the chat. So the Planning and Development Amendment Act, looking at a bit of a context for that, that was introduced into Parliament in October last year. It had 12 parts and 4 key components. There were the DAP reforms, the significant development pathway, local government roles and responsibilities in decision-making for single houses, reform of the WAPC, and other reforms to streamline processes. This was passed through both houses of Parliament in November last year and became an act on the 11th of December after it received royal assent. For those of you not familiar with how legislation works once it's been through the parliamentary process, there are either parts which are proclaimed upon royal assent or immediately after royal assent, or there are parts which are proclaimed on a fixed date. A number of parts of the Amendment Act became operational immediately following royal assent, and there are a number of parts which are yet to come into effect and be proclaimed. Some of those we will be discussing today. So for the 1st of March, there are a number of parts of the Amendment Act 2023 which will be proclaimed, and these are what you see on the screen there. There are also remaining parts from the Amendment Act of 2020 which are yet to be proclaimed and need to be proclaimed in order for either other parts of the Amendment Act 2023 to come into effect or to facilitate the introduction of new regulations. So we have Part 3 of the Amendment Act 2020, which relates to development assessment panels, and the changes are specifically related to introducing the concept of a special matters DAP and a district DAP. Now, we're not proceeding with the special matters DAP, but in order for that reference to be removed through Part 2 of the Amendment Act 2023, Part 3 of the Amendment Act 2020 needs to be proclaimed. So it's a bit of a puzzle or chess, which some pieces need to be moved in order for the new sections of the Amendment Act 2023 to come into effect. The parts of the Amendment Act 2023, which will be proclaimed on the 1st of March, are the DAP Development Assessment Panel changes. So that's removing reference to Special Matters DAP, the Development Approval for Significant Development and the Conflict Resolution provisions. So that's the new Part 11B and Part 11C, and that relates to significant development. Part 5 planning codes, so that relates to some tidy ups for the provisions for planning codes which were introduced through the Amendment Act 2020, just tidying up and streamlining processes and really just clarifying that a planning code may be referred to the EPA as opposed to it must having to be referred, so it provides a bit of flexibility. Just in recognition of the fact that sometimes a planning code may not have environmental impacts. So leaving it up to leaving it a bit of flexibility there as to whether or not something requires referral. There are also Part 11 and Section 76 specifically. That relates to tidying up some references to amendments and amendment processes and really clarifying that a basic amendment does not require advertising. There were some provisions introduced through the Amendment Act 2020, which said that basically ministerial approval was required, or ministerial consent was required prior to advertising an amendment. This created some confusion around basic amendments and whether or not that was required for a basic amendment, because basic amendment doesn't require advertising. So those changes are clarifying and tidying up that. There is a remaining part of the Act, which is Part 8, relating to the Commission reforms. That is intended to be proclaimed on the 1st of July, 2024. So I'd encourage everyone to keep their eye out for that. There are a number of regulations and supporting documents which support the Amendment Act and those new provisions. They are what you see on the screen there. So there's the significant development regulations. There's amendments to the Development Assessment Panel regulations, some amendments to the local planning scheme regulations. Those amendments specifically relate to tidying up references to planning codes, but also clarifying that a basic amendment doesn't require advertising. So just tidying up some of the things there and clarifying some things related to scheme amendment processes. There will be state planning policy regulations and planning code regulations come into effect. They relate to all of the processes to do with preparing, amending, and revoking those planning instruments. There'll be some amendments to the MRA Act relating to changing references to the R codes and clarifying that the R code and referencing the R codes as a planning code as opposed to a state planning policy, because on the 1st of March, the R codes will become a planning code. Then there are changes to the Swan Valley planning regulations just to tidy up those references to a basic scheme amendment and make them consistent with what is in the LPS regulations. So there's a number of moving parts, and it's looks quite comprehensive and complex when you see it on the screen. We have a breakdown on our website of what each of those regulations do and what parts of the Act they will support. There is also a further breakdown of the different parts of the Amendment Act, which will be coming into effect on the 1st of March as well. There are also a couple of other supporting documents. So that's Significant Development Pathway Application Guide and a fact sheet relating to the Significant Development Pathway and specifically the process for the Premier's authorisation for a significant development application. On the 1st of July, it is intended to introduce regulations for the WAPC and further amendments to the local planning scheme regulations, specifically relating to decision-making for single houses. Those amendments were not the WAPC ones, but the amendments to the LPS regulations relating to single houses were advertised recently, and that closed on the 31st of January. They relate to the what is a prescribed single house and making provision for, if anything is a prescribed single house, that those regulations will authorise the CEO to determine those applications as opposed to the council or an officer authorised by the CEO. So looking at the significant development pathway, some of the key details. So the temporary Part 17 pathway is no longer. It closed on the 29th of December last year. The new pathway will be open to applications from the 1st of March. However, given that there is a mandatory pre-lodgement process, it's very unlikely that any applications will be lodged on that date because they need to go through that pre-lodgement process prior to formal lodgement. The eligibility criteria hasn't changed from what was introduced into Parliament. So that's $20 million in Perth and Peel and $5 million elsewhere. There is the ability for the Premier, on recommendation of the Minister, to authorise an application that raises issues of state or regional importance to allow that application to opt into the pathway where it doesn't otherwise meet the eligibility criteria. There are some application types which are not eligible for the pathway, and those are applications in improvement schemes or planning control areas, public works, and applications in redevelopment areas. So some of the key details for the new significant development pathway are what you see on the screen there. So it's a 120-day assessment timeframe, the retention of pre-lodgement services and the coordinated state government referrals approach, retaining the ability to vary requirements of a local planning scheme, but with some different parameters to what existed with Part 17. So those parameters are the age of the planning framework, and if it hasn't been reviewed in accordance with legislation, which at the moment is in the last 5 years, there is also the requirement that if you do meet that test, that you then need to, the application needs to be consistent with the overarching state planning framework and any overarching local planning strategy. There is also a catch-all clause which says that if the application raises issues of state or regional importance and is in the public interest, that regardless of whether or not you meet the other criteria, if you meet those two criteria, the Commission can waive the requirements of a local planning scheme. The applications will all be determined at a public meeting, as is the case with Part 17 applications and other types of planning applications. So that will be retained. The associated regulations and documents which support the pathway and the provisions that are in the Act are the significant development regulations, the application guide, the fact sheet for the Premier's authorisation. There are application forms and checklists. There will be some delegation to department officers and a fee schedule, which will be released hopefully very soon. Looking at some of the detail in the regulations actually include the eligibility criteria and the 120-day timeframe. It also requires pre-lodgement consultation with the Commission. The pre-lodgement process is scalable and there are 3 options to choose from. Those options are outlined in the application guide. There is the ability for the Commission to require a design review. Again, that is scalable, and the different levels of design review are also outlined in the application guide. There's a 7-day conformance check period, very similar to what's in the LPS regulations, where that's where the back and forth between the applicant and the Commission needs to happen to determine whether or not the application can actually be lodged and conformed. All applications must be advertised to the public. There's that requirement, but the details of what that advertising looks like is again in the application guide. The applicant has either 7 days to accept or refuse a request for amended plans or additional information. So it is up to the applicant to determine whether or not they want to accept or refuse that request. If the request is refused, the application needs to proceed. So you can't stop the application just on the fact that an applicant has refused the request for additional information. The application needs to proceed and be determined on the basis of the information that is at hand at that time. There are stop the clock and extension of time mechanisms similar to what's in the local planning scheme regulations, and also the ability to waive certain referral and consultation requirements for amendments. So the application guide was developed in response to feedback which was received through the Part 17 process and some stakeholder reference groups which were established to help with this new significant development pathway, but also the DAP reforms. They're not as prescriptive as the local planning scheme regulations, so the guide expands upon the processes, procedures and timeframes. The document was advertised and 10 submissions were received. There was a general consensus for the content, subject to some further clarifications and refinements. Those modifications were made and approved by the Commission in January, and the application guide will be available on our website as soon as the regulations are available. One of the things we're not really keen to do is upload documents in the absence of other documents because you need to read them all together. So I would encourage you to keep your eye on the website between now and the 1st of March, and we will be uploading those documents as soon as possible. So some of the key details and associated timeframes, which are in the application guide. There's the pre-lodgement options and processes. So there's 3, as I mentioned before. There's a 14-day option, a 42-day option, and a 60-day option. So pre-lodgement light all the way through to the whole shebang. It is up to the applicant to choose which of those pre-lodgement options they would like to utilise. There are also different levels of design review, ranging from 2 different levels. There's full SDRP review or review by the government architect. There's information on what you need to submit and how to submit it. 28-day advertising requirements, which are aligned with the local planning scheme regulations requirements for complex applications. So that's notification of landowners within 200 metres of the development site, signs on site, adverts on website, and all of those similar requirements or the same requirements to what's in the local planning scheme regulations. There's consultation timeframes for local government and other state government agencies. So it's 60 days for local government, and there's a staged input for agencies to accommodate the workings of the new State Referral Coordination Unit, which we'll speak about in a second. There's information on how to satisfy conditions. It's a similar process to Part 17 approvals. The Commission will be responsible for the clearance of conditions. Looking at some other supporting changes, so there's the new conflict resolution provisions, which will be introduced through a new Part 11C. These will apply to all Part 11B applications, Part 17 applications, and other Commission applications, for example, those in improvement scheme areas. What these provisions allow is for certain more focused functions which conflict with a planning approval to be referred to the Minister. At the moment, these only relate to issues to do or functions related to traffic and transport. There is the ability for regulations, however, to be prepared in the future to address to add further functions which can be added and then referred to the Minister. So for now, there is only those conflicting approvals relating to traffic and transport issues, but in the future there may be further functions added to that. Powers of entry and inspection have also been updated because with the Commission approving more development applications, there will also be a compliance function there. So we need to make sure that the requirements and provisions for compliance were all up to date and contemporary. So the State Referral Coordination Unit, which will initially support Part 11B development applications, is a new unit which has been established within the department. And the intent and the main objective of that unit is to manage and coordinate state government, department and agency referral advice. It's expected that that their remit may be expanded in the future to support other planning and development applications. But for now, the main focus will be on Part 11B. The Referral Coordination Unit will work collaboratively with the Referral Coordination Group. That consists of representatives from all different state government agencies and departments which intersect with the planning process and planning system. And the aim of that group is for a particular application to generate a single state referral response, which represents a whole of government view rather than different bits and pieces from different agencies. The unit will also provide a case management service to assist proponents, assessors, and decision makers throughout the life cycle of a proposal as well. So how is this going to work internally in terms of who will be assessing the applications? We have a state development assessment unit who already deal with our Part 17 applications. Moving forward, this unit will also be responsible for Part 11B applications. However, there will be dedicated resources to deal with Part 17 and dedicated resources to deal with Part 11B, just because those parts are a little bit different, and in particular Part 11B has a statutory time frame, Part 17 doesn't. So in order to ensure that the applications for Part 17 continue to proceed, but the applications for Part 11B also continue to proceed in accordance with statutory timeframes. There'll be dedicated resources for the processing of applications for each of those parts. So moving on to the DAP reforms, which go hand in hand with the significant development pathway, there are amendments to the Development Assessment Panel regulations, which will be coming into effect on the 1st of March. There will also be updated standing orders, code of conduct, and practice notes to support the new system. What are some of the key details? So there's the reduction of the panels from to 3. So you will have Metro Inner, Metro Outer, and a regional DAP. There will be the appointment of fixed-term, regular, and sessional specialist DAP members. The regular specialist DAP members, the DAP will be their sole employment. The sessional members are like the pool of members that we currently have. There is currently an expression of interest process, which is open at the moment for the recruitment of both those regular specialist members and the sessional specialist members. Because we won't be ready to go with the regular specialist members on the 1st of March, we will continue to use the sessional members to ensure that the DAP can continue to function while those regular specialist members are appointed. So in the interim, we'll be using a reduced pool of specialist members. There's a removal of mandatory thresholds, so the system becomes entirely opt-in for development over $2 million. Multiple and group dwellings of any size above $2 million will be able to opt in, so it's removing the exclusion for less than 10. Development by any community housing provider will be able to opt into the system regardless if it doesn't meet that $2 million threshold, provided that it is not a single house. All DAPs will be run centrally by the DAP Secretariat to provide consistency of experience and the consistency of administration. The intent is, in most circumstances, to hold the meetings in a centralised location and to have a regular meeting schedule. There will be public broadcasting or live streaming of DAP meetings, and there's no changes to the timeframes or the composition in terms of local government membership, so it remains a 3-2. So looking at what constitutes the Metro Outer and what constitutes the Metro Inner, it's what you see on the screen. The regional DAP is the rest of the state. The Metro Outer and Metro Inner broadly align with the sub-regional frameworks. Shire of Waruna has been added to the Metro Outer DAP as well. So there's some changes to the exclusions relating to development that is wholly on a region scheme reserve or a public work. Those will revert to the Commission. They no longer need to go to the DAP. There is a new position, the Executive Director position, which has been established to oversee the governance and administration of the new DAP system, and the majority of the changes will be through the regulations. So looking at some of the other reform updates, which are also part of the Amendment Act. Got the local government roles and responsibilities in decision making for single houses. As I said, there are some changes to the LPS regulations which are required to give effect to those changes in that new part in the Act. Those are likely to come into force on the 1st of July. The same with the WAPC reform. So there's some changes to the Act, but also regulations for the WAPC. They will come into force on the 1st of July as well, hopefully, all going according to plan. Changes to scheme amendment processes. There's been some tidy ups, which I mentioned previously, just around references to basic amendments and clarifying that a basic amendment doesn't require consent to advertise because it's not required to be advertised. There is also a new online lodgement system for all applications that the state processes. That will become live on the 1st of March as well. There will be regulations for state planning policies and planning codes, which will also come into effect on the 1st of March. Those processes relate to the processes to prepare, amend, and revoke those two planning instruments. There's also some changes to the residential design codes, which is formerly what we were referring to as the medium density code, which some more further information will become available in March, and it's expected that Gazetta will happen in April. There will be further detailed information sessions on these, on the residential design code changes. So we're not going to go into too much detail. We have a couple of slides, but please keep your eye out for further detailed info sessions on those changes. So the amendments to the R codes, that was very much focused on medium density. A revised SPP was endorsed by the Commission in late 2022, released in March 2023 for deferred gazettal in September last year. As I'm sure everyone is aware, the Minister requested amendments to not proceed with amendments to the R30 and 40 coded areas in response to the pressures on housing. So what has happened since then is there's been a review which has been undertaken and some refinements have been made. So amendments and finalisation, including the revised median density code, have been announced. The amended R codes will be released in early March and will become operational in April 2024. So as I said, there will be further detail and information released in the coming weeks. So please keep your eye out for that, as well as any invites to information session. So some of the key changes are relocating R30 and 40 single house development standards back into Part B. So it's essentially reinstating the 2021 standards, but retaining the R30 and 40 group dwelling development standards in Part C and retaining 2023 draft standards with some modifications. An outline of the modifications and answers to the frequently asked questions can be found on the DPLH website at that link. And the department will be working with stakeholders, as I mentioned, on information sessions, which will be announced shortly. So the next steps are we have one more information session on Friday, and then please keep your eye out for website updates as documents become available, and prepare for the proclamation of other parts of the Act in July. If you have further questions that you think of after this presentation, or once you go back to your desk, or later on tomorrow, whenever, please email any general planning reform inquiries to the planning reform inbox. Any queries on the new significant development pathway, please email the State Development Assessment Unit. Any queries on DAPS, please email the DAPS Secretariat. Any queries on the R codes, please email the Design and Built Environment team. We will make a copy of this presentation available so that you have access to all of those required email addresses. Thank you very much for attending today, and please keep your eye out for these changes.